This is a new $400 telescope from Askar, and this is a new $400 telescope from SV Bony. These two companies are known for making affordable refractor telescopes, especially for those getting into astrophotography. And $400 is a very good price on paper for these, considering this is an 80mm ED doublet and this is a 70mm ED quadruplet. At this price though, we know there are going to be some compromises, and my goal with this review is to show all the strengths and weaknesses of these two value refractors to help you decide if one of these is right for you. My name is Nico Carver and this is Nebula Photos. For the disclosures, these telescopes were sent to me by Askar and SV Bony respectively for review. I did send both companies some written feedback on the telescopes by email, but neither company has any say in what I share with you in this video review, nor did they see the video before publication. Starting with using these telescopes visually, neither a 70mm or 80mm refractor would be my first choice if it's your first telescope and your main interest is looking through a telescope at the eyepiece. In that case, you're likely better off with more aperture and getting something like a 6-inch or 8-inch Dobsonian if you have the room and budget, because the increased light gathering of a Dob will give you better views of most objects in the night sky. But both of these refractors can definitely be used as wide-field visual telescopes, especially from dark skies like I have here in New Hampshire, and I'll give a brief report on using them that way. To use either refractor visually, I'd recommend getting a mirror diagonal, which will put the eyepiece at a better viewing angle. You'll also need at least, of course, one eyepiece and some kind of sturdy tripod or mount to hold the telescope. They both use the standard Vixen dovetail, so you can use any mount that supports a Vixen dovetail. And personally, I think you'll want some kind of astronomy mount, because while you can attach these to a standard photo tripod, since they both have a 1/4" 20 tapped hole in the bottom of their Vixen dovetail, most photo tripods, and especially most photo tripod heads, will struggle with the kind of precision, movement, and stability you want when visually observing. If you only plan to do some really casual looks at the moon with this telescope, well then a photo tripod and head would probably be fine, but for more serious visual observing, I'd suggest an alt-az mount. I'm using equatorial mounts, as you can see here, simply because that's what I have as an astrophotographer primarily, and that's what I use to test these photographically. But these equatorial mounts are unnecessarily expensive if you're just using these scopes for visual observing. For that, I'd suggest something like the SV Bony SV225 alt-az mount. My first test was during the day. This is just a distant tree, but it's a good example of the difference in field of view between the two telescopes when using the same eyepiece. I took these samples with my iPhone connected to the eyepiece, but I can confirm this is similar to what I could see visually. Later in the night, I looked at the Lagoon Nebula, the double cluster in Perseus, and the Andromeda Galaxy. I didn't have time or didn't want to connect my iPhone because that's a lot of work, so I can just tell you that those views were very similar. I'd give the slight edge to the Askar 80 ED. I then turned to the moon. Both showed a little color fringing on the bright edges of the moon, but definitely not a distracting amount of color. With the Askar visually, I could see a little bright yellow fringe, while with the SV Bony, I saw the same yellow, but then a little dimmer yellow, and then I also saw a little purple magenta color opposite that. The moon view with both was very detailed and nice. In terms of detail, I didn't see much of a difference by eye, and these iPhone snapshots are similar to what I saw. In terms of the mechanics and physical characteristics of these telescopes, I'll start with what's important for a visual observer, and then go into some considerations if you want to use them for photography. Okay, first off, both of these are pretty bare bones when it comes to what is included, and that's part of how they keep the price down. And personally, I prefer that, because most of the time when a telescope comes with a bunch of little accessories like an erecting prism and a couple eyepieces and a cheap Barlow and stuff like that, they're not of good quality. And so then I just never end up using them. They just sit around in the house. So I'd rather buy those things separately and get good quality. For a decent 2-inch diagonal and a zoom eyepiece, you're probably adding around $200 to the price. I know that these things add up, but once you get the mount, the eyepiece, the accessories, it can add up quite a bit. But if you are on a budget, you can buy a lot used, and I would always start with your local astronomy club, because you can often loan telescopes and eyepieces and see what you like before buying anything. Anyways, both telescopes include the OTA, that's the optical tube assembly, that's what we think of as the telescope, and then the mounting gear like the telescope rings and a Vixen dovetail to mount them to a telescope mount. Both telescopes have a visual back. With the ASCAR, it's just a 2-inch visual back with a compression ring that tightens with these 3 screws. With the SV Bony, it's that plus a 1¼ inch adapter for using 1¼ inch eyepieces or accessories. If you get the ASCAR and you need a 1¼ inch adapter, you can get one for about $12 on Amazon. Both have very well done, very precise rack and pinion focusers with 10:1 reduction knobs for fine movement and tensioning knobs that can also sort of lock the focus position if you tighten the tensioner all the way. The tensioner on the SV Bony is on the top of the focuser, and on ASCAR it's on the bottom. In both cases, they're nice big knobs with knurled edges. The ASCAR has 2 Cinta-style finder brackets built into the focuser. The SV Bony doesn't have any, but it does have screws, so you can add some on. SV Bony sells finder brackets for about $12 to $14, depending on the day. Now, you may be wondering, do you need a finder with a refractor this wide? That really depends on how experienced you are with astronomy. I could find the double cluster and Andromeda and other things fairly easily, just without a finder, just sort of pointing and a little basic star hopping, and then also having a zoom eyepiece and just zooming it out to 24 millimeters. But I have a lot of experience. If I was brand new to astronomy, I'd want a finder of some kind, whether it's a red dot finder or a finder scope like this. In my opinion, the red dot finder is probably the best choice with a small scope. Moving on to the rings, they're decent quality with either telescope. The only real difference here is the ASCAR comes with a top handle, which also has this open channel that you could use for attaching accessories, while the SV Bony just has tapped holes for M6 machine screws at the top of each ring, but you could use those to attach accessories as well. The dew shield on the SV Bony is retractable with a thumb screw, which I prefer as it's very easy. On the ASCAR, it's not retractable, but you can screw the whole thing off and reverse it for storage. Okay, one last thing about the mechanics of these scopes, and that is attaching a camera. I expected with the ASCAR doublet that if I didn't use a field flattener, it would take a lot of spacers and the focuser racked quite a bit out to reach focus, and that was the case. I needed about 75 millimeters of spacers to reach focus with the focuser nearly all the way out. The SV Bony I was more surprised by. Pretty much every other quadruplet refractor I have used came to focus if I added about 50 to 60 millimeters spacing to the back of the focuser threads. The SV Bony, when I racked it all the way out, was not coming to focus with the standard 55 millimeter spacing, so I kept adding more and found that I needed over 70 millimeters of spacers plus the 12.5 of the camera, so about 82.5 back spacing total to come to focus. So if you get this scope and you're puzzled, keep in mind you'll need plenty of spacers to reach focus. This could be seen as a good thing, as it gives you plenty of room for accessories like filter drawers and an OAG and a rotator, whatever you want. You could fit it all in with this scope and still reach focus. I'm fairly confident, even if you put all that stuff on, that this focuser is robust enough with all that weight, because it is a rack and pinion. Okay, now I want to go through a little bit more about the options for connecting your camera. I get questions about this a lot, and I'm going to try to include it in reviews going forward. If you get the field flattener or flattener reducers for the ASCAR ADED, it's easy. You just take off the visual back, screw in the field flattener, and then it's 55 millimeter from the threads of the flattener, and those threads are the standard male 48 millimeter threads. So if you have an astronomy camera, just use both spacers it came with. If using a filter drawer, you can usually replace one of those 2 spacers with the filter drawer. If you have a DSLR or mirrorless camera, get a 48 millimeter wide T adapter for your model. I prefer the William Optics one, and then that's all you need to connect. Okay, so that's the easy one if you get the ASCAR with the flattener. The ASCAR without a flattener or the SV Bony in all situations is a little more complex. Remember, these both require the camera to be pretty far back to reach focus, even with the focuser travel almost all the way out. So to connect a camera, the easiest way, just get a bunch of spacers, attach them to your camera somehow, end the spacer stack with a smoothbore 48 millimeter spacer with enough room. This is also known as a 2-inch nose adapter, and insert that whole thing into the 2-inch visual back and then tighten that down. That would work with either telescope, and it's the easiest option. I'd be a little bit worried about tilt, but I think it would work as long as your spacers are nice and secure. But you are connecting via a compression ring. I'd prefer a threaded connection. So what if we take off the visual backs and try to connect with all threaded adapters and spacers? With the SV Bony, this is definitely possible because I've done it. With the ASCAR, I'm not as sure. The SV Bony focuser tube ends in 54mm female threads, but every kind of imaging train is expecting male threads here. So the first thing we need to do is use a 54mm M2M adapter. I had this $25 one from Pegasus Astro around, and after you add that, it becomes pretty straightforward. We can just use a stack of 54mm spacers, or if you need to go down to 48mm to connect to your camera, then 54 to 48mm adapters are easy to come by. The ASCAR focuser tube appears to end in a thread size that isn't an astronomy standard. I measured it with calipers and it appears to be 58mm. I did find a 58mm to 48mm step down ring on Amazon, but since it seems to be designed for mounting filters on a lens, it's changing from male thread to female thread. So then you would also need a 48mm M2M adapter in the stack. And I'm not sure if this is even going to work because I don't know if there's enough threading there to make this secure. But in any case, this is obviously not fully tested, but perhaps possible. In all my actual testing with the ASCAR, I use the 2-inch compression ring to connect or one of the optional flattener reducers, which is what I'd really recommend because those are straightforward and all threaded connections. Okay, now we're about ready to look at the deep sky photographs taken with these two telescopes. I'm going to be throwing in a few results I took on the same night with the ASCAR 71F flat field refractor as well, because its current price is $660, and I think that's close enough in price and definitely close enough in specs to these two telescopes to be a good comparison to look at. Okay, now we're going to look at all of the images that I took, and this will be very illustrative as how the telescopes actually perform on deep sky imaging. But I wanted to quickly go over the tech specs, basically how I took these images. The camera I used was the ASI 2600MC Air, which is a color, one-shot color APS-C crop sensor camera. It has the ASI Air built into it, which just makes it convenient for this kind of thing. It also has a guide chip built into it, and all of these pictures you're going to see were with auto guiding turned on. The mount I used was the Skywatcher EQ AL55i, which is about a $850 mount, something around there. And then the filter I used for almost all of these images you'll see is no filter, although the 2600MC has a UV-IR filter built into it. The SV Bony SV220 7nm dual narrowband with the band passes on the HA emission line and the O3 emission line was used for the final couple images I'll show you. And when we get to the stacked exposures, I stacked 12 at 3 minutes each, which gets us to a little bit more than 30 minutes, 36 minutes. And at gain 100, 0 degrees Celsius, bias darks and flats were used to calibrate those images in the stack. This was all taken from my Bortle 3 backyard. The target was the North America and Pelican Nebulae in Cygnus, which I chose because from my location, it's always high in the sky right now. When I start at around 10:30 p.m. to 2:30 a.m., it's always between 50 degrees up, and it crosses right at the zenith at this time of year. Okay, we're going to first very quickly look at some single 3-minute exposures without any calibration done to them. So this is just straight from camera. And the reason I like to show these is to show if there's any kind of vignetting present with a crop sensor. And here's the SV Bony, here's the ASCAR without a flattener, here's the ASCAR with a flattener, and you can see so far we're not seeing any vignetting really. Here's the ASCAR with a 0.85x reducer. Now you're seeing maybe just a little bit if you are used to this kind of thing. Here's the 0.7x reducer, but really not much at all. And here's the ASCAR 71F, just as a comparison. And really, these are all well illuminated, so no issue with vignetting. But for looking at other things like the quality of the stars, I like to use stacks because it's more real world and any kind of aberrations on the stars will show up much better with a small stack of exposures compared to just a single. So here is the SV Bony on the left, and this is 12 times 3 minutes. And the major thing that stands out is on most of the bright stars, we're now seeing a sort of fringe of not the true color of the star. It's sort of a purplish fringe, and that comes from just the combination of glass types they use in the telescope. The ED type they're using is FPL 51. In other SV Bony scopes, we've seen them use FPL 51 and not have this much color fringe. So it really, I think, comes down to the combination of glass types and how they're using them. The ASCAR 80ED without a flattener isn't showing that kind of purple fringe, but it's also a very soft picture with very aberrant stars. So this is if you use both telescopes just as is at $400 with that camera. With the ASCAR 80ED, they're really suggesting you use them with one of the field correctors. Here's the 1x field flattener, and you can see it radically changes the picture. One thing I get asked about a lot is, well, what if I was just using a very small sensor? Do I need to buy the field flattener? And so let's look at the center of these two fields. And to my eye, yeah, I mean, there's a huge difference in sharpness, even in the very center between not using the field flattener and using it. So I think that's basically, if you're going to use it for photography, that's a needed purchase. So it does increase the price from $400 to $589 because the telescope is $400 and then the 1x field flattener is $189. Okay, looking at the other two field corrector options for the ASCAR, this is the 0.85x reducer, and you can see it expands the field of view from the 1x, and then here's the 0.7x, which expands the field of view even more. So you could get all three, and then you have three different fields of view, but if it was me, I'd probably just definitely buy the 1x flattener and then maybe the 0.7x, since that gives you such a different field of view. Okay, and then comparing them to the ASCAR 71F, let me minimize these for a second. So now we're looking at the SV Bony on the top here, the ASCAR 71F on the bottom, and the difference in price between these is $400 for the SV Bony and $660 for the ASCAR 71F, but they're both flat field refractors, meaning the corrector elements are built in, quadruplets. And so you can see that they offer a very similar field of view. The 71F is slightly more cropped in, but the 71F doesn't have that purple fringing. And then if we compare them to the ASCAR 80ED with the 1x flattener, the major difference here is the doublet is bloating some of the bright stars a little bit. So you may or may not like that look. Okay, and I wanted to point out one other thing with the stars with the ASCAR 80ED that's true no matter which flattener or flattener reducer you use, which is this is an APS-C size sensor again. And if you imagine if I was using something like a ASI 533 or a 585 chip, then we'd only be covering this middle part of this field. And in that case, all of the stars look pretty round and perfect. But on a crop sensor, as we get to the edge, we are getting some aberration on the bright stars. So here's a bright star, and you can see this looks a little funky. It looks like sort of like a bite has been taken out of the halo facing the center. To show you on the 0.7x reducer, it starts showing up on even moderately bright stars, and on the bright stars towards the edge of the field, it's even weirder because it's like there's like two little chunks taken out of the star halo. And again, they're sort of facing the center. So since this one is on the left, the good side of the star is on the left. And since this one down here is on the right, the good side of the star is on the right with the aberrant side facing the center. So that is something that you could fix in Photoshop if you are a Photoshop wizard. And since it only affects bright stars, that might be worth doing. But I did want to point out that on the ASCAR 71F, it's not really a problem. You can see here's that same star, and the star halo is a little bit offset. So there's a little bit of aberration, but it's not as noticeable as on the ASCAR 80ED with any of the flatteners. But if we go in a little bit and look at these stars, you can see they're slightly smaller on the ASCAR 71F, but I actually sort of like that extended, very soft halo we're getting with the ASCAR 80ED. So there are some star profiles that I actually prefer how the ASCAR 80ED is rendering them. And then just out of interest, with those same two stars right next to the Pelican, here's the ASCAR 80AD 1X Fladner in the bottom right. Here's the ASCAR 71F in the bottom left. Here's the SV Boney in the top left. And here's the ASCAR 80AD with the 0.7X reducer in the top right. And personally, again, my preference with this pair of stars is the ASCAR 80AD with the 1X Fladner. Okay, now we'll just briefly look at corner star performance. We've already been sort of looking at the stars, but this is just something called the Abberation Inspector, which shows us the center of each frame and then the corners and the centers of each edge. And so the SV Boney, as we've been discussing, is showing a lot of purple fringing on bright stars. The ASCAR 80AD without a Fladner has very aberrant stars, as we'd expect. With the Fladner, it corrects very well. It looks about as well corrected as the 71F. And then with the different reducers for the ASCAR 80ED, they're pretty well corrected, but the bright stars are showing that distortion that we looked at before. Okay, my next example is I ran a software processing tool called Russell Croman's BlurXterminator, which is a $100 paid plugin, and it's only available for PixInsight. But the reason I did it is because it's become a popular tool, and I wanted to correct some misconceptions about it. A thing that I see online a lot is that it will perfectly correct all your stars, and you'll go from an image that looks really messy and wrong to an image that looks great. It does do deconvolution really, really well by breaking apart the image and doing it in tiles. And so it applies a different point spread function to the center and to the corner. So it does a lot of very cool technical things, but it can't really fully correct things as much as people suggest online. Let me show you what I mean. So for instance, over here on the right, this is the ASCAR 80AD with no Fladner. And if we look at what it looked like before, here's before, here's after. So it obviously did a really good job of sharpening up the stars because this looks way, way softer than this image. But at what cost? If we zoom in, we can see in order to do that, it had to leave all of these little streaks that basically become like noise. It sort of turned the image into one with like walking noise, because to correct the stars like that, it couldn't make up all of the data that it needed to. So it had to basically leave all of these weird little streaks across the image. So it's just an example where it will correct the stars, but then leave other artifacts. And the same thing with the SV Boney. So here's before BlurXterminator, here's after, and you can see zoomed out like this, it seemed to really reduce that purple fringing. But now let's zoom in. If we look at what it did, it's like this used to be sort of a bluish color. Now it's green, but this is a blue star. But now it looks like white and green. Here's another even worse example of what it did. Okay, so now instead of purple fringing that extended out to here, we have purple fringing that extends out to here, and then we're left with a green ring around that. This, to me, looks harder to clean up and fix than how it was before. So BlurXterminator does things, and with very good data, it just makes very good data better. But with data with problems, the way it will fix it can be sort of unpredictable, and it can sometimes actually make it harder to get to the final image you may want. One more example, which is, does it get rid of that sort of deformed star halo with the ASCAR reducers? And the answer is no. Here's how it looks. It's sharper, but it's not gone. It's still quite present. Okay, up until now, all of the pictures we've been looking at were with no filter. I did want to show what these two telescopes look like if you use a dual narrowband filter, because with the SV Bony, we've been seeing that purple fringing on the stars with all of the images. If you use a dual narrowband filter, because that spectrum is completely cut out by the filter, you now don't get any of that purple bloat, because that's down in like sort of the ultraviolet and deep blues and stuff. And so it looks quite a bit better, and it really does equalize it in terms of the star profiles with the ASCAR 80ED with Fladner. These aren't zoomed perfectly, so the stars look bigger over here. But, you know, it's like they're very, very similar after you use the dual narrowband filter. So keep that in mind. If you are going to be using a dual narrowband filter, maybe you only shoot from light polluted areas, then the SV Bony is looking pretty good. And these images, I think I only got 15 minutes on each. So this is 5 times 3 minutes on each one. Okay, and then as a final little test, I took this dual narrowband data, I combined it with the broadband data using the broadband stars, but processed all of this data as best as I could with the SV Bony over here on the left, the ASCAR 80ED with the 1X Fladner on the right, and tried to process them again, as best I could for each data set, but also trying to get to a similar result. And here is what I was able to create. So we have the SV Bony on the left, the ASCAR on the right. I'm sorry for the slightly different crops. That just came down to user error, basically. But I think it's pretty interesting because they end up looking fairly similar. The major difference being the bigger, brighter stars on the ASCAR 80ED, I was able to leave alone, basically. While with the SV Bony, I did have to leave them smaller to avoid getting any of that sort of purple fringing. But I was impressed that with the right stretch and software processing, I was able to, I think, make a pretty pleasing star field with the SV Bony. But let me bring up the same crop so we can zoom in and take a look. Okay, so in terms of the amount of detail, the ASCAR 80ED looks slightly sharper. I'm not sure if that comes down to just the optics or the slightly larger aperture, or maybe a combination of both, but both look pretty respectable. There's the Cygnus wall. Okay, and this star right here is actually a good example. So here's the flaw with the ASCAR 80ED. It has like a little bite taken out of it. And then the flaw with the SV Bony is I did a fair amount of star processing to get to this result. So there's a little bit of artifacting left if you're really a pixel peeper. And I could probably clean that up further if I was really going hardcore in Photoshop. But if you look sort of closely there, you can see that star halo isn't perfect. And that comes down to I was trying so hard to correct the stars and not leaving that purplish halo. Now, if we look at this star right here, let me zoom in a little bit more on it. You can see in the ASCAR, it does come out its correct color, which is sort of a yellowish gold. In the SV Bony, with my correction, it's coming out more just white, but not objectionable. And with an image like this, which is combining the dual narrowband data, I think these stars look pretty good. Okay, here's an example of that was like the best I could do with correction on that star. Over here, it looks better, but this star looks pretty good. And zoomed out, that weird sort of correction I did doesn't look as bad. And then just to quickly summarize what we've learned and sort of the strengths and weaknesses of each, the SV Bony is a flat field 70 millimeter refractor. It's well corrected in the corners, but it does show quite a bit of purple fringing when you shoot with it broadband. When you shoot with it with a narrowband filter, a dual narrowband filter, that disappears. So if you're mostly going to be shooting with a dual narrowband filter, the SV Bony is a compelling choice at $400 all in. The ASCAR 80ED doesn't show any purple fringing like the SV Bony, so the colors are more natural and pleasing, but it is more expensive once you add in the 1X flattener or one of the flattener reducers, and it's not fully corrected to an APS-C field. If you look at bright stars with an APS-C size sensor towards the edge of the frame or in the corners, they will have that distortion of a little bite taken out of the star profile. If you use a smaller sensor like micro four thirds or smaller, or a popular chip like the IMX 533 or 585, you're not going to see these problems because you're cropped in on basically just the center. So the ASCAR 80ED would be a compelling choice for smaller sensor shooters or crop sensor shooters if you're okay with how those distorted star profiles look or are okay with correcting them in Photoshop. All right, I think that sums it up, and hopefully this was useful if you're thinking about buying a refractor that's around 70 to 80 millimeters, especially for imaging, but hopefully that visual observation test was useful as well. And you're now seeing everyone who supports this channel on my Patreon campaign at patreon.com/nebulaphotos. I can't thank everyone who already supports me enough because it's how I'm able to do Nebula Photos full time and bring you very detailed reviews like this one, but also tutorials. Many of the tutorials that I do, like the Serial and free software tutorials, don't perform very well on YouTube. So having that support through Patreon is really what allows me to keep doing them while having this as my full-time job. So if you're interested in joining us on Patreon, there's a bunch of benefits to you. I'm now doing a monthly bonus video over on Patreon. And so this past month, July, it was a PixInsight tutorial, the program you've been seeing. But then next month, it'll be something else. And every month from now on, you're going to get a free bonus video if you join over at Patreon, even at the $1 tier. But if you join at higher tiers, like the $7 tier, you also get every video I do ad-free and sometimes early. And there's other perks as well. If you're interested, you can go to patreon.com/nebulaphotos to check it out. Till next time, this has been Nico Carver, Clear Skies.